Souls-like games are evolving fast, and some of these upcoming titles already look incredible. With brutal boss fights, insane graphics, and new ideas pushing the genre even further, some of these games already look seriously impressive. So here are 18 of the most anticipated Souls-like games coming soon. Swords of Legends is a new single-player action RPG from a Chinese developer, and visually, the game already looks incredibly polished. The combat has that fast, flashy action RPG style where you're dashing around giant enemies while swords, magic, and supernatural abilities light up the screen. You play as an underworld enforcer responsible for guiding lost souls into the afterlife while dealing with monsters inspired by Chinese mythology. One of the more interesting mechanics is the soul capturing system, where certain enemies can be captured and summoned back into battle to fight alongside you. The combat also looks really fast and stylish, with weapon switching, special abilities, and summon-based attacks all blended together. And honestly, I like that the game seems more focused on cinematic fantasy action instead of just copying From Software's style.
What? The soulless husk?
The living cast their dead to flame, and sacrifice ignites the war banners!
The Relic First Guardian feels much closer to a traditional Souls-like, but it also has a few ideas that help it stand out a bit. It's a dark fantasy action RPG from Korean studio Project Cloud Games, inspired by Korean mythology and folklore. And the world already has that bleak, everything is cursed and miserable atmosphere that Souls fans usually love. The setup is pretty simple in the best way possible. A massive relic is destroyed, the world falls into chaos, and now you're traveling across the ruined kingdom of Arsiltis, trying to restore what's left while fighting horrifying monsters and massive bosses along the way. But the combat is what really caught my attention. The game apparently removes stamina costs for attacking, which shifts the focus more toward aggressive combat, combos, parries, dodges, and build customization through relics and gear instead of traditional leveling systems.
Thing you left behind. Father, the wind blew again today. Mother says the wind is you.
Though this...
Because you were the first guardian.
GeniGods Nezha seems like one of those games where, as soon as the trailer begins, it's immediately clear why people keep comparing it to Black Myth Wukong. The visual style, the giant mythological creatures, and the flashy combat all give off that same kind of energy right away. You play as Nezha as she fights against massive gods and mythological creatures pulled straight from ancient Chinese legends. And the combat already looks extremely aggressive, with fast movement, aerial attacks, huge weapon effects, and giant boss fights. Basically everything you'd want from a modern action RPG games. What really caught my attention, though, is the scale of some of the enemies. Some of these bosses look absolutely massive, almost like something straight out of Shadow of the Colossus, except they're furious Chinese deities trying to wipe you out completely.
Many.
10,000 years are too long.
Oh, righteous! And after everything you and your awful put him through too. Were you feeling left out?
The path of the sword. On my strength alone. I don't need some monster's power.
The power of the Oni is all that's sustaining your life. That's an Oni gauntlet.
Musashi! Gun me! This thing's made me so damn strong.
Onimusha Way of the Sword honestly feels like Capcom's way of reminding us they've been crafting dark fantasy samurai action for years. Back on the PS2, Onimusha was already mixing demon-filled worlds, brutal sword combat, and supernatural powers years before this style became so popular again. This new game follows Miyamoto Musashi fighting through a demon-infested version of Kyoto using the Oni Gauntlet. And from the gameplay shown so far, the combat looks heavy and deliberate. Not exactly slow, but every sword strike feels like it has real weight behind it. It honestly feels closer to something like Sekiro, mixed with classic Capcom action design, rather than a pure Souls-like. And visually, the combat animations look incredibly good. The sword clashes, the parries, enemies getting sliced apart. Capcom's RE engine is clearly doing a lot of work here. There also seems to be a much bigger focus on timing and reading enemy movements, instead of just attacking non-stop. Zoopunk is a new dieselpunk action RPG from Thai Games, and this thing already looks completely chaotic in the best possible way. You've got neon-lit cities, animal warriors carrying oversized weapons, and fast-paced combat that barely slows down for a second. The story takes place in a world shaped by a mysterious energy source called the Fire Seed, with different factions and regions fighting over it, while everything slowly falls apart around them. And from the gameplay shown so far, combat seems heavily focused on mobility, combos, and timing-based defense mechanics instead of slower, more methodical Souls-like combat. What I really like is how aggressive the gameplay looks. Characters are constantly dashing around, chaining attacks together, switching weapons, and launching enemies into the air. It has that stylish action game energy where the developers clearly want combat to feel flashy and satisfying.
Machine Legion doesn't stand a chance against me. What? Huh? I'm the Papa!
Right on time! Miss me?
La Divina Commedia might have one of the more unique concepts out of these upcoming action RPGs because it's pulling directly from the classic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise setup, instead of just doing another dark medieval kingdom with zombies everywhere. The game's coming from Giamma Games, the studio behind Inotria The Last Song, so they already have experience with Souls-like combat. But this project sounds a lot more ambitious. They're mixing action RPG combat with hack-and-slash mechanics, procedural dungeon elements, and a morality system connected to the 7 deadly sins. What helps it stand out is the atmosphere. A lot of Souls-like start blending together visually after a while, but this one already feels more distinct with its religious imagery, twisted monsters, and surreal environments. Beast of Reincarnation is probably one of the biggest surprises here, simply because it's coming from Game Freak. And yeah, when most people hear Game Freak, they immediately think of Pokémon. The story follows Emma alongside her dog companion Ku while traveling through a ruined version of Japan, corrupted by something called the Blight. which also immediately creates that dangerous emotional setup where you just know the dog is going to become the most important thing in the entire game. The combat looks like a mix of fast sword fighting, special abilities, and companion mechanics where Ku actually fights alongside you instead of just existing to emotionally destroy players later. And visually, the world already looks surprisingly beautiful, with giant overgrown ruins and abandoned cities that give off that "the apocalypse happened a long time ago" atmosphere that always works so well in games like this.
故郷って何？
いつか帰る場所だ。
Ballad of Antara is one of those games that immediately got compared to Elden Ring. And honestly, once you see the gameplay, it's easy to understand why. The atmosphere, giant monsters, dodge-heavy combat, and dark fantasy setting all clearly carry that Souls-like DNA. The game comes from Tipsworks Studio, the team behind Pascal's Wager, which is a good sign because these developers already have experience making Souls-like games. This doesn't feel like a studio randomly jumping on the trend. One thing that helps the game stand out is the multiple playable characters called emissaries. Each one has different abilities, combat styles, and story elements tied to a world split between two realities. So instead of focusing on one fully customizable build, the game seems more character-driven.
War. Mortality. These essences shall not fall into your treacherous hands. Wayward emissaries, grant us the forgotten miracles. Rain fire from above. This desolate flame needs a sprinkle of madness.
Phantom Blade Zero is starting to feel less like one of those flashy reveal trailers and more like a real action RPG powerhouse waiting to happen. Every time S-Game shows new gameplay, the combat somehow looks even faster and crazier, but still controlled enough that it never turns into complete hack-and-slash chaos. You play as Soul, an elite assassin who gets framed for killing the leader of his organization. After being mortally wounded, he's left with only 66 days to survive while tracking down the people responsible. It's a really strong setup because the story immediately feels personal and desperate instead of just another generic save-the-world plot. The combat is easily the biggest highlight. The developers describe the style as Kung Fu Punk, and honestly, that description fits pretty well. The game blends fast martial arts combat, heavy sword attacks, and cinematic boss fights that feel somewhere between Sekiro and classic martial arts movies.
It won't make any difference at the end of the day. You know better than anyone else that no one could escape.
Everyone wears a mask. You too.
This is a real face.
He let you live? What secret did you sell him?
Kaidan already looks like one of the darkest upcoming action RPGs based on atmosphere alone. The whole game has this cold, miserable Japanese horror vibe, with ruined villages, snow-covered landscapes, grotesque yokai creatures, and enough fog to hide at least 12 horrible things waiting to kill you. The game comes from Fifth Column Studio, and from the footage shown so far, it seems to mix Souls-like combat with extraction-style survival mechanics and co-op gameplay. So instead of just beating bosses and moving on, there's this constant tension of trying to survive long enough to escape with your resources and gear intact. The combat also looks slower and heavier. Big melee weapons, deliberate attacks, dangerous enemies, lots of spacing and timing. It feels closer to Neo mixed with survival horror than a full-on flashy action game.
And slay Seeker.
Lest you wash up again on my shores, your frail body shattered and broken.
Crimson Moon looks like one of those dark fantasy action RPGs where it feels like nobody in the world has experienced happiness for the past several hundred years. The atmosphere alone already screams Souls-like. Giant ruined castles, cursed-looking enemies, heavy armor. Everything looks bleak in exactly the way fans of this genre usually love. The game comes from Studio Crimson, and from what they've shown so far, the combat leans heavily into methodical melee fights with dodges, parries, and large boss battles. There are also magic abilities mixed into combat, so it doesn't seem fully focused on pure swordplay. Some of the gameplay honestly gives off a mix of Elden Ring and Lords of the Fallen, especially with the darker, gothic environments and oversized monsters. One thing I actually like is that the world design seems more focused on horror atmosphere than just giant fantasy spectacle. Mortal Shell 2 honestly feels like one of the safer bets on this list, simply because the first game already proved Cold Symmetry understands what makes Souls-likes satisfying. Mortal Shell didn't completely reinvent the genre, but it had enough unique ideas to stand out, especially with the shell mechanic. This sequel also looks way more ambitious. Bigger environments, faster combat, more weapons, more enemy variety, and apparently a much stronger focus on exploration compared to the first game's smaller, interconnected areas. The shell system is returning too, where you inhabit different warrior bodies with their own stats and abilities. And honestly, it's still one of the more interesting mechanics we've seen from a Souls-like in years, because it completely changes your playstyle depending on which shell you're using. Project Windless already feels completely different from most fantasy action RPGs, simply because you're playing as this massive bird-like warrior charging through armies with giant swords. And honestly, the more you see of it, the cooler it starts to look. The game comes from Crafton Montreal and is based on a huge Korean fantasy universe called The Bird That Drinks Tears, which also explains why the world immediately feels stranger and less familiar than typical Western fantasy. The races, creature designs, and mythology all have this weird, almost alien feeling to them in a really good way. Gameplay-wise, the scale already looks huge, with massive battlefields, fast melee combat, giant enemy groups, and enormous monsters all happening at the same time. Vanran looks like one of those brutally dark Souls-likes that's trying really hard to make every fight feel dangerous and miserable in the best possible way. The whole setup is basically pure dark fantasy suffering. You play as Caleb, a fallen commander thrown into the demon realm after a failed rebellion, and now everything around you wants you dead. Combat already looks much more aggressive than slower traditional Souls-likes too. Faster movement, chained attacks, dodges, grappling movement, big flashy finishers. It almost feels closer to Nioh pacing-wise than classic Dark Souls combat. One mechanic that actually sounds pretty interesting is stealing powers from defeated enemies and demon lords. So instead of just leveling stats normally, a lot of your progression apparently comes from absorbing abilities from things you kill, which honestly fits the whole corrupted hellscape setting pretty perfectly.
From this moment, you are erased, as though you never lived. The abyss devours you. Eternal darkness shall be your torment.
Some escape in daydreaming, some in madness.
Valor Mortis is coming from one more level, the studio behind Ghost Runner. So the moment they announced they were making a Souls-like, a lot of people immediately paid attention. And honestly, it already looks like it could end up being something really unique. The game takes place in an occult version of the Napoleonic era, where you play as a resurrected soldier fighting through supernatural monsters, corrupted battlefields, and giant nightmare-like bosses. That alone gives it a very different atmosphere compared to the usual medieval fantasy Souls-like setting. The combat also looks much faster. There's grappling hook movement, aggressive melee combat, firearms, and even some Metroidvania-style level design mixed into everything. And honestly, more Souls-like should experiment with movement like this because it instantly makes exploration and combat feel more dynamic. The Duskbloods instantly became one of the biggest talking points the moment From Software revealed it. A lot of people immediately got Bloodborne vibes from the gothic atmosphere, blood powers, dark cities, and all the horrifying creatures shown in the trailer. The combat also looks much faster and more mobile than Elden Ring, with gunplay, supernatural abilities, aerial movement, and all kinds of mobility mechanics that give the game a very different feel from a traditional Souls-like. What makes it even more interesting is that the game is built around PvPvE multiplayer instead of a fully single-player structure. Players known as Bloodsworn fight both monsters and each other across this dark fantasy world, which already makes the whole thing feel way more unpredictable. Lords of the Fallen 2 feels like Hexworks looked at the 2023 reboot and decided to double down on what actually worked. Bigger areas, faster combat, and a much bigger focus on player feedback this time around. The first game already had one of the more interesting mechanics in modern Souls-likes with the Umbral system, where you could shift between the living world and a horrifying dead dimension filled with monsters. And instead of replacing it, the sequel seems to be expanding that idea even further. Combat also looks much smoother now. The reboot already leaned more aggressive than classic Dark Souls, But this time they seem to be pushing mobility, dodging, magic, and weapon variety even harder. Black Myth Zhong immediately grabbed people's attention because it's coming from the same developers behind Black Myth Wukong, so the moment the trailer dropped, expectations shot through the roof. And honestly, it's easy to see why. The Chinese mythology influence, the dark fantasy atmosphere, and the cinematic boss fights all give it that same large-scale, supernatural action RPG feel. But this game actually has a pretty different setup. You play as Zhong, the legendary demon hunter from Chinese folklore, known for hunting evil spirits and supernatural creatures. Because of that, the whole game already feels much darker and more horror-focused than a lot of action RPGs out right now.